Sometimes the soul that changes a kingdom arrives on 4 tired paws instead of wearing a crown. The first snow of December drifted silently across Blackpine Hollow, covering old wagon tracks and weathered rooftops with a blanket of white that made everything look gentler than it truly was. From a distance, the little mountain town appeared peaceful, wrapped in pine forests and soft morning light. But Emily Carter knew appearances could be painfully deceiving. At 23, she had spent her entire life learning how invisible an Omega could become. She walked with her shoulders slightly lowered, not because she lacked confidence, but because years of whispered judgment had taught her that drawing attention usually ended in humiliation. That afternoon, the town square buzzed with excitement as unmated wolves gathered for the annual Winter Bond Festival. Bright lanterns swayed above the wooden stalls while children laughed around crackling fire pits, and every hopeful family quietly dreamed that someone important might notice their son or daughter before spring arrived. Emily had almost convinced herself not to come, yet loneliness carried a weight heavier than fresh snow. She stood near the edge of the square, bundled inside an old blue coat her late grandmother had stitched years before, warming her hands around a paper cup of hot apple cider. Conversation slowed as people noticed her. Some looked away politely. Others didn't bother hiding their pity. A young woman whispered something that made her friends smile behind their scarves. Emily pretended not to hear. She had become an expert at pretending. Then the town elder announced that the visiting Alpha delegates would greet everyone before sunset. Excitement rushed through the crowd like electricity. People straightened their clothes, adjusted their hair, and stepped closer to the center. Emily instinctively stepped back instead. She knew no powerful alpha would ever cross the square searching for someone like her. A careless shoulder bumped against hers, spilling warm cider across her gloves. "Watch where you're standing," a man muttered without slowing down. Emily quietly apologized, though she wasn't sure she had done anything wrong. By the time the festival reached its loudest moment, she slipped away unnoticed. The forest path welcomed her with peaceful silence, replacing laughter with the gentle whisper of snow-covered branches. She breathed more easily beneath the towering pines, where no one expected her to smile through another awkward conversation. Twilight settled quickly, painting the sky deep shades of blue and silver. As she approached the tiny cabin she called home, something unusual caught her attention. Large paw prints crossed the fresh snow leading directly to her front porch. They were far too large for any ordinary wolf. Emily stopped walking. Her heartbeat quickened, but curiosity proved stronger than fear. Sitting beside her weathered front door was an enormous wolf with thick silver and white fur dusted in snowflakes. One ear twitched as though it had heard her long before she arrived. Its pale gray eyes opened slowly, carrying an intelligence that felt almost unsettling. The wolf looked exhausted, slightly dirty, and thoroughly unimpressed by the world around him. The moment their eyes met, he released a low, irritated huff, turned his head away as if refusing to acknowledge her existence, and settled deeper against the porch. Emily blinked in surprise. "Well," she whispered with the faintest smile she had worn in weeks, "you're certainly not very friendly." The wolf answered only by flicking the end of his tail once before closing his eyes again, as though he had already decided this porch, and perhaps this quiet, forgotten Omega, would do for tonight. Emily remained standing in the snow for several long seconds, expecting the enormous wolf to rise, bare his teeth, or disappear into the forest without a backward glance. Instead, he simply sighed, the sound carrying all the weary annoyance of someone who had endured an impossibly long day. His thick fur lifted gently with every slow breath, and although he clearly heard every movement she made, he refused to look at her again. The silence felt strangely familiar. Emily knew what it meant to be too tired to explain yourself to the world. She carefully unlocked her front door, pushing it open just enough to slip inside. Warm air scented with cinnamon and cedar drifted into the cold evening. Before closing the door, she hesitated. The wolf remained exactly where he was, snowflakes gathering across his broad back. "You know," she said softly, "I cannot promise much, but I do have a warm fireplace." One silver ear flicked. Nothing more. Emily almost smiled. "I will take that as a maybe." She disappeared inside and returned moments later carrying an old quilt and a shallow wooden bowl filled with fresh water. She placed both several feet from the porch steps, before quietly backing away. The wolf watched every movement from the corner of one eye. He did not approach the bowl until Emily closed the door behind her. Through the frosted window, she watched him slowly stand. Even favoring one front leg slightly, he carried himself with remarkable dignity. He lowered his head to drink only after scanning the dark tree line, as though making certain no hidden danger remained nearby. Emily noticed the faint scrape above his shoulder where patches of fur had been rubbed away, leaving irritated skin beneath. It looked uncomfortable rather than severe, and for reasons she could not explain, her heart tightened. Whoever you are, she thought, life has not been especially kind to you either. The following morning, she found the bowl empty and the quilt folded into an untidy heap, as though the wolf had somehow attempted to put it away without understanding how blankets worked. She laughed quietly to herself for the first time in months. When she stepped onto the porch carrying a slice of homemade bread and a small plate of roasted turkey left from Thanksgiving, the wolf was sitting several yards away beneath a towering pine, pretending complete indifference. His eyes followed every step she took while carefully avoiding direct eye contact whenever she noticed. "You are not fooling anyone," Emily murmured. "You are curious." The wolf answered with an exaggerated yawn before looking toward the mountains as though the clouds were vastly more interesting. Emily placed the food beside the porch and returned indoors. Only after several patient minutes did the wolf approach. He sniffed cautiously before eating with quiet restraint, never rushing, never begging for more. There was something unexpectedly refined about him, something almost impossible to describe. Even the way he settled beside the porch afterward resembled a silent guardian rather than a stray searching for scraps. Throughout the day, Emily worked inside her little cabin repairing old sweaters for neighbors who rarely thanked her. Every now and then she glanced outside. The wolf remained nearby, sometimes sleeping, sometimes watching the forest with calm, alert eyes. As evening settled once more over Black Pine Hollow, distant voices echoed from the snowy road leading through town. Two travelers paused outside her property, studying the unusually large paw prints around the cabin. One lowered his voice. "The royal search party has reached the neighboring valley," he said. "They say the Alpha King vanished 3 nights ago, and nobody knows whether he is alive." Emily barely noticed the conversation before the travelers continued walking, but outside beneath the pine tree, the silver wolf slowly lifted his head, his expression suddenly thoughtful in a way no ordinary animal could ever imitate. The news lingered in the quiet cabin long after the travelers' footsteps disappeared beneath the whispering pines. Emily tried to dismiss it as another mountain rumor. Stories about royalty had a way of growing larger with every mile they traveled, especially during winter when people gathered around fireplaces with little else to entertain them. Still, she found herself glancing through the frosted window more often than usual. The silver wolf had not moved from beneath the tree. He sat perfectly still, watching the distant road with an unreadable expression that seemed almost concerned. "Surely that cannot have anything to do with you," Emily said with a gentle laugh as she pulled another sweater through her sewing needle. The wolf slowly looked toward the cabin before deliberately turning his head away again. "That was almost an answer," she whispered. The second morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Overnight, nearly 6 inches of fresh snow had transformed the hillside into a sparkling blanket of untouched white. Emily wrapped herself in her old blue coat and stepped outside carrying another bowl of water and a small basket filled with slices of roasted chicken, fresh carrots, and warm biscuits. The wolf was gone. Her heart sank more than she expected. She stood quietly on the porch, searching the silent forest. "I suppose you decided to continue your journey," she murmured. Just as she turned toward the door, snow scattered behind her. The wolf emerged from between 2 evergreens carrying a bundle of dry firewood balanced carefully across his broad shoulders. Emily froze. The wolf walked directly to the porch, lowered the neatly gathered wood beside the chopping block, then sat down with an expression that almost suggested satisfaction. Emily stared at the stack of perfectly selected cedar logs before looking back at him. Did you bring me firewood?" The wolf blinked once. "That is impossible." Another slow blink. Emily folded her arms, trying very hard not to smile. "You are the strangest stray I have ever met." His tail gave the faintest movement before becoming perfectly still again, as though he had accidentally revealed too much. From that moment forward, an unusual rhythm settled over the cabin. Emily cooked enough for two, although only one of them ate indoors. Every morning the wolf disappeared briefly into the forest before returning with something unexpectedly useful. Once it was fresh herbs growing beneath sheltered rocks. Another time he dragged back a small sled someone had abandoned after last winter's storms. When a strong wind loosened part of the roof, Emily discovered broken branches already stacked beside the house, ready to be trimmed into replacement supports. She never saw him gather any of it. Somehow it simply appeared. "You are either incredibly thoughtful," she said one evening while brushing snow from his thick fur with an old wooden brush, "or you dislike seeing people struggle." The wolf endured exactly 7 careful strokes before standing with exaggerated dignity and walking 3 steps away, clearly pretending the attention had become unbearable. Emily laughed again, warmer this time. The sound echoed across the snowy clearing like music the little cabin had not heard in years. Hidden beneath all his dramatic size and stubborn pride, she began to notice something else. Whenever strangers walked past the property, the wolf quietly positioned himself between Emily and the road. He never growled. He never frightened anyone. He simply watched until they continued on their way. It was subtle enough that Emily almost missed it. Almost. Late that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Mrs. Harper, an elderly widow from town, carefully climbed the porch carrying a basket of apples. She stopped the moment she noticed the enormous wolf sitting beside the steps. "Mercy," she whispered. "That creature could belong in a king's palace." Emily smiled gently. "He only looks intimidating. He has been nothing but kind." Mrs. Harper studied the wolf for several thoughtful seconds. To Emily's surprise, the old woman lowered her head respectfully before speaking in an almost reverent voice. "Those eyes," she whispered. "I have only seen silver eyes like that once before, many years ago, when the royal family passed through Blackpine Hollow. Child, if I were you, I would keep this remarkable visitor close. Some gifts arrive wearing disguises that only the heart can recognize." By the morning of the 3rd day, Emily no longer questioned why the silver wolf remained beside her cabin. Somehow his quiet presence had become part of the rhythm of her life, as natural as the smoke curling from the chimney or the soft creak of the old rocking chair on the porch. The forest no longer felt empty. Even silence seemed warmer when shared. She stepped outside just after sunrise carrying a steaming bowl of oatmeal sweetened with maple syrup and fresh blueberries she had preserved before winter arrived. The wolf was already awake, sitting on the ridge overlooking the valley as pale sunlight painted silver highlights across his thick coat. For a long moment, he simply watched the distant mountains, his posture carrying a quiet authority that did not belong to any ordinary stray. Emily walked toward him carefully, stopping several feet away before setting the bowl on a flat stone. "You probably think this is beneath your standards," she teased softly, "but it is the best breakfast I can offer." The wolf glanced at the bowl, then at Emily, releasing another familiar sigh that somehow sounded almost theatrical. She laughed. "There it is again. You have opinions about everything, do not you?" He lowered his head and sampled the meal with visible reluctance, only to continue eating a moment later with much greater enthusiasm than he intended to reveal. Emily pretended not to notice. The tiny victory made her smile brighter than she had in years. As they returned toward the cabin, hurried voices drifted through the trees. Several riders approached along the snowy road wearing dark cloaks embroidered with the crest of the Northern Crown. Their horses moved with disciplined precision, and every rider scanned the forest as though searching for something precious that had disappeared. Emily instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. The silver wolf quietly moved until he stood beside her shoulder. One of the riders slowed his horse and studied the cabin. "Have you seen an unusually large silver wolf in these woods?" he asked politely. Emily hesitated before answering honestly. "There are many wolves in Blackpine Forest." The rider nodded, though disappointment crossed his face. "If you happen to notice one unlike the others, send word to the governor immediately. The kingdom offers a generous reward for reliable information." Emily thanked him, and the group continued deeper into the valley. Only after the hoofbeats disappeared did she look down. The wolf had not taken his eyes off the departing riders. There was no fear in his expression, only patience. Were they searching for someone important? Emily wondered aloud. The wolf slowly looked at her before walking toward the porch without another sound. That afternoon, a fierce winter wind swept across the mountains, carrying thick clouds that darkened the sky long before sunset. Emily hurried outside to secure loose shutters before the storm reached the valley. A sudden gust caught the ladder beneath her feet, sending it sliding several inches across the icy ground. She gasped, reaching instinctively for the edge of the roof. Before panic could settle into her chest, the silver wolf leaped onto the porch with astonishing speed and braced his powerful body firmly against the shifting ladder. The movement was smooth, controlled, and impossibly precise. Emily climbed down safely, her boots finally touching solid ground. She knelt beside him, gently resting one gloved hand against the thick fur around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "You always seem to know exactly when I need help." The wolf held her gaze for several quiet seconds. Behind those pale silver eyes, she thought she glimpsed loneliness deeper than the endless winter forest itself. Without thinking, she wrapped the old blue scarf from around her own neck and carefully tied it loosely around his broad shoulders. "Now everyone will know you have a home," she said with a warm smile. The wolf remained perfectly still, as though no one had ever offered him something so simple without expecting anything in return. Above them, the first heavy snowflakes of the approaching storm began drifting silently from the darkening sky, while somewhere far beyond the mountains, a distant hunting horn echoed across the frozen wilderness. The storm arrived just after sunset, swallowing Blackpine Hollow beneath curtains of swirling snow that blurred the line between earth and sky. Wind rushed through the towering pines with a lonely song that rattled every shutter on Emily's little cabin. Inside, the fireplace glowed with steady warmth while cedar logs cracked softly beneath dancing flames. Emily wrapped another quilt around her shoulders and glanced toward the porch. "You can come inside if you change your mind," she called gently through the door. "I still think you are much too stubborn." She expected only silence. Instead, a familiar huff answered from outside, followed by the faint sound of a heavy body settling against the porch wall. Emily smiled to herself. "I will take that as another no." She finished mending a wool blanket before opening the door once more. Snow had piled almost a foot deep across the porch, yet the silver wolf remained exactly where he had been, the blue scarf still resting around his broad shoulders. Snowflakes clung to the soft fabric, making it look almost royal against his silver and white fur. "You really do like sleeping outside," Emily whispered. This time the wolf looked directly at her, his silver eyes calm and impossibly gentle before he lowered his head again. She left another bowl of warm broth beside him and quietly returned indoors. Before dawn, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. Emily hurried to answer the door and found 3 anxious townspeople bundled against the cold. Mr. Dawson, the blacksmith, removed his hat respectfully. "Emily, forgive us for arriving so early, but everyone is worried. Royal Guards have closed the eastern road. They are searching every property near the forest." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Did something happen? "Nobody knows for certain," Mrs. Harper answered softly. "Some say dangerous rogues crossed the mountains. Others believe someone important disappeared." Emily thanked them for the warning. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Dawson suddenly noticed the enormous wolf sitting beside the porch. His expression changed immediately. "That animal should not be here," he said carefully. "He is not dangerous," Emily replied. "He has done nothing except help me." Another neighbor frowned. "You cannot know that. Wild wolves belong in the forest. If the Royal Guards find him here, they might assume the worst." Emily looked toward the silver wolf. He remained perfectly still, listening to every word without making a sound. She gently shook her head. "He chose this place for a reason. Until he decides to leave, he is welcome here." The neighbors exchanged uncertain glances before quietly walking back toward town. After they disappeared beyond the snowy hill, Emily stepped onto the porch. "It seems you have become the most talked-about resident in Blackpine Hollow," she said with a small smile. "You certainly know how to attract attention without saying a single word." The wolf slowly stood and walked toward the edge of the clearing. For several moments he stared into the distant forest, every muscle alert beneath his thick winter coat. Emily followed his gaze, but saw nothing except falling snow drifting between endless rows of pine trees. Then she heard it. Horses. Many of them. Their distant hoofbeats rolled through the frozen valley like approaching thunder. The silver wolf turned back toward Emily. Their eyes met across the white clearing, and for the first time since he had appeared outside her cabin, she noticed unmistakable concern behind his calm expression. Without hesitation, he walked back to the porch and quietly positioned himself between Emily and the road once again. Emily gently rested her hand against the blue scarf around his neck. "Whatever is coming," she whispered, "you do not have to face it alone." The wolf closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though her simple promise carried a meaning far greater than she could possibly understand, while beyond the trees the approaching riders drew steadily closer with every passing heartbeat. The hoofbeats grew louder until they echoed through every corner of Blackpine Hollow. Emily stepped to the edge of her porch, pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders as snow continued falling in slow, heavy sheets. The silver wolf remained beside her, perfectly calm despite the approaching riders. His ears stood alert, but there was no fear in his posture, only quiet certainty. Moments later, nearly a dozen mounted guards emerged from the forest road. Their dark cloaks carried the silver crest of the Northern Crown, now dusted with fresh snow. Behind them rode a distinguished older man with neatly trimmed white hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. The entire group stopped several yards from Emily's cabin. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes settled upon the enormous wolf standing beside the lonely Omega. The older man slowly dismounted and removed one leather glove before offering Emily a respectful nod. "Good morning," he said with calm courtesy. "My name is Lord Nathaniel Ashcroft, Royal Advisor to the Northern Crown. We are searching for someone of great importance." Emily returned the greeting. "I have heard the town speaking about your search." Lord Ashcroft's gaze shifted toward the silver wolf. Something almost impossible to describe flickered across his composed face before disappearing again. "May I ask," he continued carefully, "how long that wolf has been staying here?" Emily looked toward her unusual companion. "Today is the third day." Several guards exchanged uneasy glances. One tightened his grip on the reins, while another quietly whispered something Emily could not hear. Lord Ashcroft remained remarkably composed. "Has he harmed you in any way?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Never. He has protected my home, gathered firewood, and frightened away no one except people who frightened themselves." A faint smile almost reached the advisor's face. "That sounds familiar." Before Emily could ask what he meant, another rider urged his horse forward. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 30s, with a stern expression that revealed growing impatience. "My lord," he interrupted, "we cannot delay any longer. If that truly is the wolf we have been tracking, we should secure him immediately." The moment those words left his mouth, the silver wolf slowly rose to his full height. He did not growl. He did not lunge. He simply stood with quiet confidence beside Emily, the blue scarf resting across his shoulders like a promise. The clearing became completely silent. Even the horses seemed reluctant to move. Emily instinctively stepped closer to the wolf. "Please," she said softly. "He does not understand why everyone keeps following him." The younger rider shook his head. "Miss, you do not understand who." Lord Ashcroft gently lifted one hand, silencing him at once. His thoughtful eyes never left the wolf. Then, to Emily's complete surprise, the older man slowly bowed his head. It was not a deep bow, but one filled with unmistakable respect. Several guards immediately followed his example without being asked. Emily blinked in confusion. "Why are you doing that?" she whispered. No one answered. Instead, every royal guard continued standing in respectful silence before the motionless wolf. Snow drifted peacefully between them, settling upon polished armor and evergreen branches alike. The silver wolf looked at each member of the royal party before turning his attention back to Emily. His expression softened in a way she had never seen before. There was gratitude there, relief, perhaps even affection hidden beneath the familiar mask of stubborn pride. Lord Ashcroft finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Miss Carter, I believe the time has come for the truth to reveal itself. There are moments when destiny chooses the most unexpected doorstep." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She looked from the advisor to the silent wolf wearing her old blue scarf, still standing faithfully beside her cabin as though it had always belonged there. Deep within the surrounding forest, the winter wind suddenly fell still, leaving the clearing wrapped in an almost sacred silence, while the first rays of morning sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated the silver wolf with a brilliance unlike anything Emily had ever witnessed. Emily could not explain what changed first. Perhaps it was the air itself, suddenly warmer despite the falling snow. Or perhaps it was the way every royal guard lowered his eyes as though standing before someone they had honored their entire lives. The silver wolf remained perfectly still in the center of the clearing. His pale eyes rested only on Emily, carrying the same quiet patience she had seen since the evening he appeared on her porch. Lord Nathaniel Ashcroft slowly took another step forward before stopping several yards away. "Your Majesty," he said with unmistakable respect, "the kingdom has been waiting for you." Emily frowned in confusion. She looked toward the wolf, then back at the advisor. "Your Majesty?" she whispered. Before anyone could answer, a soft silver glow surrounded the wolf like morning sunlight reflecting across fresh snow. The light was gentle rather than blinding, flowing through the quiet clearing without fear or force. Emily instinctively took one small step backward, not because she was frightened, but because she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. The silver wolf closed his eyes. The glow slowly grew brighter, wrapping around him like drifting ribbons of moonlight. When it finally faded, the enormous animal was gone, standing where he had been only moments. Before was a tall man with fair skin, broad shoulders, and dark hair lightly dusted with melting snow. His silver eyes were exactly the same. So was the familiar expression that balanced quiet pride with gentle annoyance, as though the entire situation had become far more dramatic than he would have preferred. Around him rested a long, dark cloak embroidered with the royal crest, though Emily had no idea where it had come from. The old blue scarf she had wrapped around the wolf's neck remained carefully folded across his shoulders. The clearing became so silent that Emily could hear snowflakes settling upon the pine branches. Every royal guard immediately knelt. Lord Ashcroft lowered himself with them, placing one hand over his heart. "Welcome home, Alpha King Alexander Wolf." Emily stared at the man before her, unable to speak. Her thoughts raced through every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every theatrical sigh, every carefully gathered bundle of firewood. The grumpy stray who refused to come inside. The silent guardian who watched over her cabin every night. The wolf who always stood between her and danger. It had been him all along. Alexander slowly looked around the clearing before his attention returned to Emily. For the first time since she had met him, he smiled. It was small, almost uncertain, but unmistakably real. "You brushed snow from my fur," he said, his deep voice calm and warm. "You argued with me over breakfast. You gave me your favorite scarf because you believed no one should face winter alone." Emily blinked several times. You could understand everything I said?" A faint spark of amusement reached his silver eyes. Every single word. Emily covered her face with one hand, unable to decide whether she wanted to laugh or disappear into the snow forever. "That is deeply embarrassing." A few guards quietly smiled without lifting their heads. Alexander's expression softened even further. "To me, it was the first honest kindness I had received in a very long time." Emily slowly lowered her hand. "But why were you here? Why become a wolf?" Lord Ashcroft answered gently. "An ancient trial requires every ruler of our kingdom to walk among ordinary people without title or privilege. Most are recognized within hours. Some are feared. Some are admired because of their crown. His Majesty wished to know whether anyone would offer compassion without expecting anything in return." Alexander took one unhurried step toward Emily. Snow settled across his dark hair, while the blue scarf moved gently in the winter breeze. "For 3 days," he said quietly, "you saw nothing but a difficult stray with nowhere to go. You never asked what I could give you. You simply gave what you had. That is rarer than any treasure a king could ever possess." Emily looked into the familiar silver eyes that had watched over her little cabin since the first snowy evening, and in that single breathtaking moment, she finally understood why destiny had chosen the quietest doorstep in Blackpine Hollow. Emily stood speechless as the snow drifted gently around them, her heart struggling to catch up with the truth. The man before her was no longer simply the mysterious wolf who had guarded her lonely cabin. He was Alexander Wolf, the Alpha King whose name had echoed through every mountain town in the Northern Territories. Yet despite the royal guards kneeling around him, despite the crest embroidered across his cloak, the first thing he reached for was the faded blue scarf she had wrapped around him during the storm. His fingers lightly brushed the soft fabric before he looked back at her with quiet gratitude. "No one has ever given me something because they believed I needed comfort," he admitted. "Most people offer gifts because they recognize a king." Emily lowered her eyes. "I did not know who you were." "Exactly," Alexander answered. "That is why your kindness mattered." Lord Nathaniel slowly rose to his feet while the guards remained respectfully silent. "Your Majesty, the council has been waiting for your return. Every province fears the worst. The people believe you have vanished." Alexander nodded without looking away from Emily. "The kingdom has waited 3 days. It can wait a few moments longer." His calm answer surprised even the royal advisor. Emily noticed the brief smile that crossed the older man's face. Before he respectfully stepped back, the clearing suddenly filled with another familiar sound. Curious townspeople had begun gathering near the forest road after noticing the royal horses. Mr. Dawson arrived first, followed by Mrs. Harper and dozens of neighbors who had spent years barely noticing Emily's existence. They stopped in stunned silence as they recognized the kneeling guards and the man standing before the little cabin. Whispers spread through the crowd. "That is the Alpha King. He was here." With Emily? Faces that had once looked past her now stared in complete disbelief. Emily shifted uncomfortably beneath their attention. She had never wanted to become the center of any gathering. Alexander noticed immediately. During the 3 days he had spent beside her porch, he had learned every small expression that crossed her face. Without speaking, he quietly stepped beside her, placing himself where the crowd's attention naturally shifted toward him instead. The simple gesture made Emily feel strangely protected. Mrs. Harper slowly walked forward until she stood at the edge of the clearing. Tears shimmered in her gentle eyes as she looked from Emily to the blue scarf resting across Alexander's shoulders. "I told you," she whispered warmly. "Some gifts arrive wearing disguises." Emily smiled through the emotion gathering in her chest. Alexander turned toward the townspeople, his voice carrying calmly across the snowy clearing. "For generations, people have measured worth by strength, status, and titles. During the past 3 days, no one offered shelter to a tired traveler except one woman who possessed very little by the world's standards and yet gave freely without hesitation." His silver eyes returned to Emily. She expected nothing in return. Silence settled over Blackpine Hollow. Several neighbors lowered their heads, remembering every moment they had overlooked the quiet Omega who spent years helping others without asking for recognition. Mr. Dawson removed his hat. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Others followed. One after another, voices filled the snowy clearing with simple words that should have been spoken long ago. Emily listened without bitterness. She did not need revenge. She had only ever wanted to be seen. Alexander gently unfolded the blue scarf and adjusted it across his shoulders once more before speaking with a quiet smile that only Emily fully understood. "I believe this belongs exactly where it is." She laughed softly, remembering the grumpy wolf who had refused to come inside despite every invitation. "You are still stubborn," she whispered. A trace of familiar amusement warmed his silver eyes. "Some things," he replied, "do not change simply because someone remembers who you are." Snow continued to fall long after the crowd had fallen silent, covering old footprints until the clearing looked untouched once again, as though the mountain itself wished to remember this day not for its surprise, but for its quiet truth. Emily stood beside Alexander, still struggling to believe that only 3 mornings earlier she had opened her front door expecting nothing more than another lonely winter day. Instead, she had found a grumpy silver wolf who sighed at warm breakfasts, stubbornly refused to sleep indoors, and somehow filled the empty spaces of her life without either of them noticing when it happened. Alexander slowly turned toward Lord Nathaniel Ashcroft. "The kingdom has waited long enough," he said calmly. "We will return before nightfall." The royal advisor bowed. "At once, Your Majesty." Horses were quietly prepared while the guards respectfully gave their king and Emily a few private moments. Neither of them spoke immediately. Words suddenly felt unnecessary after everything they had already shared without them. Emily looked toward the little cabin resting beneath the tall pines. Smoke still drifted lazily from the chimney. The porch still held the wooden bowl where she had first left fresh water for a stranger she believed had nowhere else to go. Nothing about the cabin had changed, yet somehow everything had. "I suppose," Emily said with a soft smile, "you will not be sleeping on my porch anymore." Alexander looked toward the familiar spot beside the front door and allowed himself a quiet laugh. "Probably not." She folded her arms playfully. "That is unfortunate. I had almost convinced myself that you secretly enjoyed oatmeal with maple syrup." "I did," he admitted without hesitation. Emily looked at him in surprise. "Really? I simply believed it was my duty to appear difficult." She laughed so freely that several nearby guards exchanged amused smiles. Lord Nathaniel quietly whispered, "That is the first genuine laugh I have heard from His Majesty in many years." Alexander pretended not to hear him. Instead, he reached into his cloak and carefully removed a small silver pendant shaped like a mountain pine. It was simple, elegant, and carried none of the extravagance one might expect from a king. He placed it gently into Emily's hand. "This is not payment," he said before she could misunderstand. "Kindness should never be purchased. Think of it as a promise that the road between Blackpine Hollow and the royal palace will always remain open to you." Emily closed her fingers around the pendant. "I do not need a palace." Alexander smiled. "I know." His silver eyes reflected the quiet snowfall surrounding them. "That is one more reason I hope you will visit someday." Emily looked up at him with the same honesty that had welcomed a lonely wolf 3 days earlier. "Only if you promise one thing." "Anything." "When life becomes too heavy, remember that there is still a little cabin in the mountains where you are allowed to be nothing more than a stubborn wolf who forgets his manners." For a brief moment, the Alpha King closed his eyes as though committing every word to memory. "That," he answered quietly, "may be the greatest invitation I have ever received." Before mounting his horse, Alexander turned toward the gathered townspeople one final time. "Let today be remembered for this," he said. "A person's worth is not revealed by the title they carry, but by the kindness they offer when they believe no reward will ever come." No one argued. No one questioned him. They had already witnessed the truth standing quietly beside a forgotten cabin beneath falling snow. As the royal procession disappeared beyond the pine trees, Emily remained on the porch watching until the last horse vanished into the white horizon. The forest became peaceful once again. She looked down at the silver pendant resting in her palm, then smiled as she noticed several large paw prints still preserved beneath the fresh snow leading to her front door. The wind gently stirred the empty porch where a grumpy stray had once refused every invitation to come inside. And for the first time in many years, Emily no longer felt forgotten, because sometimes destiny does not arrive with trumpets, crowns, or grand speeches. Sometimes it simply curls up outside your front door, waits patiently for a bowl of warm food, and quietly reminds the world that the strongest hearts are often the gentlest ones.